Well, welcome to our panel, everyone. It's so great to see so many smiling faces in the room. I'm Jacqueline Howard. I'm a health correspondent at CNN, and I'm proud to announce our session, Anxious Girls, Lonely Boys. I am joined by this esteemed panel. I'll first start with Dr. Lisa DeMoir. She is a psychologist and author of the newly updated book, Untangled, and author of The Emotional Lives of Teenagers. Welcome, Lisa.
So much.
We have Christopher Pepper here. He is author of the Substack Teen Health Today and co-author of the forthcoming book, Talk to Your Boys. Welcome, Christopher.
Thank you so much.
And we have Dr. Sima Saguier. She is co-founder and CEO of Surgo Health. She also built the largest equity-forward tracker for youth well-being and mental health here in the U.S. Welcome. And the purpose of today's panel, we do hope to delve into the youth mental health crisis here in the United States. According to CDC data, the percentage of high school students experiencing symptoms of depression, these are symptoms like hopelessness, prolonged sadness, that percentage has increased from 28% in the year 2011 to about 40% in 2023. So that's how much of a rise we've seen in these symptoms of depression. And a separate 2023 CDC report found that teen girls in particular, they are experiencing record high levels of violence, sadness, and suicide risk, with nearly 1 in 3 reporting seriously considering attempting suicide. And when it comes to young men, a Gallup poll suggests that they are among the loneliest people in the U.S. 25% of those ages 15 to 34 report feeling lonely a lot of the day. In an American Enterprise Institute study, over a quarter of men under age 30 said they have no close friends. So we are seeing this loneliness epidemic, so to speak. So the question here is, how can we identify signs of distress in our youth? How do these signs and symptoms present differently for girls compared with boys? And what can we each do to respect and support the emotional lives of our children? And I would love to pose those questions to our panel today. When we think about this backdrop, this context, my question for each of you is, how do we see these signs and symptoms present in our young people, and what factors do you think are driving what we're seeing today in the youth mental health crisis? I'd love to start with you, Lisa.
Sure. So thank you for having me. I always love being here. We are seeing a wide range of symptoms like you're talking about, and we do see a gender breakout. But one of our jobs as a panel is to actually trouble the title, right? The putting kids into very sort of, for the benefit of a title, simplified versions of this. And the way that I want us to really think about this is to recognize anytime you see a difference, you're actually seeing a difference in the mean. And this audience knows the mean is the top of overlapping bell curves. So we may see more anxiety in girls, which we do. We may hear more boys reporting loneliness. But we never want to lose sight of the fact that actually there are a lot of boys who are more anxious than the average girl, a lot of girls who are more anxious than the average boy. So it gets murky fast. And we owe it to our kids to really look at the kid who's right in front of us, gender aside, and try to take seriously how they are suffering.
And Christopher, I know you work closely with young men. How are you seeing this loneliness epidemic emerge?
Sure, thank you for having me. This is an issue I'm really concerned about. And I work with middle and high school boys in San Francisco public schools, and a lot of them really, like the statistic we cited says, a lot of them just don't have a lot of close friends. They feel like they're looking often for both peers to connect with and adults to connect with, and looking for connections beyond surface level. But that is one thing that I really see is people feel lonely. We've seen a big decrease in the amount of time that young people spend hanging out, and we've seen a decrease in the amount of dating that young people do. And what that's largely been replaced with is individual time where people, it may feel like they're connecting with others because they're often on their phones, or with boys, they're often going home and playing video games, usually with headphones on, and they're chatting. They can hear other people in their headphones, so it feels maybe like they're connecting with other people. But I just think that kind of connection doesn't give you the kind of rich feedback that in-person time with other people gives you. And as an effect, I think we're seeing boys kind of go through adolescence and not really fully develop the social skills that they need to be caring, compassionate, connected adults.
Yeah.
Thanks, Jacqueline. So I'm going to also muddy the story a bit, and I'm the data person on this panel. So we actually went out and we've been asking youth themselves and really hearing from them. And so we've been building something called the Youth Mental Health Tracker, which I encourage you to have a look. It's actually a public good available for everyone. And one of the things we wanted to understand, actually sampling from more than 10,000 youth, is how are they feeling, but more importantly, why are they feeling the way they're feeling? And again, just to muddy the story, actually about half of our youth feel quite satisfied about life, which is really positive and great. And even those that are experiencing mental health issues in the last 2 years feel hopeful about the future. So I do think our youth are actually quite resilient, and our job is really to figure out how to tap into that resilience and help them cope with the situation. And then the one other thing I will add, I think the really important question we should be asking is, why is this happening? What are those factors that are driving this? And youth told us that there are really 6 important things, which hopefully we'll dive a little bit into. But number one, as I think came up now, is social connection. This is one of the most important factors, and I think that's on us to really figure out how to ensure that youth are having the social connection. The second one is a sense of belonging. Youth who feel a sense of belonging actually feel more satisfied, less depressed, less anxious. Stress is a big one. Academic stress, which was really shocking. 3 out of 4 youth feel an extreme pressure of academic stress, and many of them feel quite stressed about things like climate change, global conflict, local politics as early as 10 years of age, which I think says a lot about what's happening in our society. And then, of course, the other things that you may know about, things like adverse life experiences, as well as physical activity, sleep, and things like that. But I do think there's a real story here in terms of how can we focus on these factors to really help our youth to not only thrive, but also really not have these mental health issues.
And I am really fascinated that social media and screens actually was not something reported in that survey, because it does come up often in conversations. And I also think about the Jonathan Haidt book, The Anxious Generation, and how there is that focus on screens and social media, and how we're seeing a decline in a play-based childhood, which is also similar to work we saw from the researcher David Elkind in the 1980s, who wrote The Hurried Child. And even in the 80s, there was this mention of a decline in a play-based childhood and more of a focus on having a scheduled childhood. So with that research as a backdrop, the hurried child and the anxious generation, not to oversimplify those 2 themes, I am curious how what we're seeing today may be a continuation of those themes, and how, if at all, how much of an impact screens and social media may be playing a role as one of the factors that you mentioned.
I forgot to mention that. It did come up as one of the factors, but social media is pretty complicated. It allows youth to both connect as well as distress. And youth are pretty cognizant about this, on this kind of dual role of social media. So, I think older youth report that more than 80% of their time, the things that they see on social media actually makes them anxious. So, but at the same time, for a lot of youth, it also allows them to connect. So I think we have to really think of it in a nuanced way.
Well, and to that point, right, if we think about like a pie chart of the things that impact adolescent mental health negatively, social media is a slice of that pie. We know that. It needs guardrails around it. It needs regulation. But a much bigger slice of the pie about what influences adolescent mental health are their relationships with their adults right around them. And so one of the things we have to be really careful about is, while we're trying to put guardrails around social media, we don't go about it in a way that actually harms their relationships with the adults right around them. So we can't make rules that strike them as arbitrary. We can't go about it in a way that leaves them feeling cut off from their friends. There are ways to put guardrails around social media in partnership with kids, It really works well instead of saying it's the adults versus the kids in the phones. It's much better to have it be like it's the adults and the kids versus these technologies that are not designed with their health in mind and making sure that they're using them well. But one concern I have as someone who kind of watches the whole pie is I worry that we're spending a lot of time on one slice, sometimes to the expense of talking about the other slices, or even in a way that could be net negative. If we get kids off social media while harming their relationships with adults, that's not going to leave them in a better place.
So social media really is a very thin slice
It's a
of the
comparatively,
overall pie.
right? There's a lot of other things, and Sema mentioned it. I mean, kids worry about the future. Academic pressures come up, discrimination, housing insecurity, food insecurity, early trauma. I mean, that's the pie. So social media is important and needs guardrails and regulation, but we don't want to talk about it to the exclusion of all of these other factors that are very important.
And you did mention a relationship being a very, very important factor. And as we think about some of the differences we see among girls and young women compared with boys and young men, how is the importance and impact of relationship possibly different, if at all, for these two different groups?
Sure. So I think we do a better job of socializing girls to know how to have friends, to know how to make friends and maintain friendships. One thing that I see going on with boys is that boys exiting elementary school, often those social skills are not very well developed. And they need help with things like making a play date. They need help with making plans with friends, the sort of skills that people need to navigate the world. We want them to learn those skills. But often, that middle school transition time is when families decide to give a kid a smartphone for the first time. And what I see happening is that when that transition happens, often the parents are sort of like, I don't want to make play dates for you anymore. You can navigate your own social life. And boys in particular often don't have the skills to really do that very well. So their social interactions are largely happening with their own guidance and happening either via phone or social media or on video games. And I would encourage you, if you haven't had this opportunity, hang out with a middle schooler who's playing video games where they're online with their friends. They're in one house, their friends are in some other houses, and listen, just be in the background as much as possible. Listen to how they talk to one another, because they are communicating, but that communication often is very heated, often includes slurs that you would not want them to say, often includes a lot of cursing and telling other people, like, go kill yourself, and just very casually kind of threatening language. And when I think about, is that a good way to kind of learn and practice the social skills that will help that boy be someone that you'd want to live next to or work next to, or have your child date or marry? They're not learning those skills very well from that social environment. And that's where I think we need a little more adult intervention, supervision, and just knowledge of what's going on.
And when you mentioned kind of the middle school era, so to speak, or the middle school time, that also makes me think, as we look at the overall continuum, the overall time of a child's development, at what point during that developmental continuum do we see this divergence between the needs of girls and young women and boys and young men? When do we see this divergence in their needs, but also maybe in some of the mental health symptoms they may present if they are facing some challenges? Or
have always seen a significant onset of mental health concerns with adolescents. The onset of adolescence, which is around 10 or 11, and then after that. And one of the reasons is there's so much happening all at once, right? They are changing socially, cognitively, physically, emotionally. All of this is happening. And one of the ways we've sort of summarized it is moving parts break, right? When there's so much happening, there's real potential for things to go off the rails. And then, what's interesting is we see them going off the rails in different ways. Your question earlier about gendered patterns, notwithstanding what I said about overlapping bell curves, one thing that we often see or say is that when girls are upset, they discuss it. When boys are upset, they distract themselves. Video games being a key thing. This isn't all bad, but if you take it to its extremes, what you see in girls is what we call rumination, right? And this is how we get these higher anxiety findings. Rumination is where you're talking about something, talking about something, talking about something. And the girls, of course, are great. Like, they'll get together and do a group analysis of the problem, right? Which is not helping anymore. And that's where it can turn into anxiety, depression. Boys, on the other hand, if they have a rough day, they might just be like, I'm gonna go home and get on my video game. And they let the feeling die down, but they're sitting alone with a lot of distress. So the goal really is to get everyone more towards the middle, right? To have boys discussing more, and frankly, distraction's a perfectly reasonable form of coping, so long as it's not taken to an extreme.
And then are there cultural dynamics that may impact these gender differences? Other factors like socioeconomic status, race and ethnicity, identity, just anything else that may add to the differences that we're seeing.
Can I add to what Lisa said? So again, I just want to just share something what we're hearing also from the youth, which I think supports Lisa, but it's interesting. The types of relationships that youth are telling us when we look at, for example, 13 to 17-year-olds versus 18 to 24-year-olds seem to be quite different for men, boys, and girls. Girls want those close connections, and they keep those connections that they develop in early adolescence towards adulthood. Boys, on the other hand, again, Christopher, I'd love to hear from you, but this is what they're telling us, is that, when they move to that early adulthood, they're looking for more one-on-one, meaningful connections that are really around purpose. They want to feel purpose. They want to feel more that they're with someone shoulder to shoulder. They want to feel that, they want role models in their lives. And so that's something that's coming up in the data. And I'm curious, before we get into those other differences, whether that resonates, maybe, Christopher, what you're seeing with the boys, because that's something that comes up in the data.
It does. I think the idea of purpose is really smart to bring that up. That is something that we've seen really helps teenagers just have a concept of where their life is going, having a sense of contributing to the world. I think we've had a lot of cultural change around the place of men in the world, and that plays out in boys' lives and in the conversations and pressures that they face. A lot of boys talk about feeling constricted. We sometimes, when we're teaching about this, we call this the man box. It's this concept of feeling like there's kind of a box around someone and a particular way of being a man in the world. And if you go outside the lines of that box, you might face teasing, you might face mockery, you might be excluded from the group, so you're outside of the friend group that you used to be part of, or you might face violence. And as a result, boys tend to walk around very self-conscious of how they're expressing themselves in the world, thinking about, how do I dress? Is it okay to say I like somebody? Is it okay if I say that I like this particular thing? Thinking about how they physically move their bodies, thinking about what activities they will let themselves be part of and what they'll exclude themselves from. So it's this very restrained and restricted way of being in the world. And all of that gets in the way of connection. If someone is not showing you their true self, if they're not being vulnerable or opening up some space, it's hard to connect with them in a real way. So you end up with all these boys walking around feeling constricted and then saying, I actually feel lonely because nobody knows the real me.
I want to pick up on the purpose piece real quick. So we find this over and over again, that purpose really matters. And I will tell you, as someone who cares for teenagers and their families, I love the finding, but I think often parents are like, oh my gosh, like purpose, like that feels huge. Like my kid's supposed to cure cancer. Like how do I make this happen? And so I want to just quickly cite research from Andrew Fellini, who works at UCLA in their adolescent section. And he has this great finding that he was sharing with me, which is what it really is about is it feeling that someone is counting on you, feeling that you're counted on, that actually gets all of the good outcomes we're looking for with purpose. So what I would say is, like, especially like a 14-year-old boy, right? It's like, you're in charge of the dog, right? Or we need you to set the table, right? That these much more attainable and frankly child-sized things can do the work of purpose until they are ready to think about the grand contributions they'll make to the world.
I totally agree. I think we can do a lot with boys in particular, to encourage them to move into caring roles, like taking care of the dog, but being a camp counselor, doing things where you're a mentor for a younger kid. And overall, I would love to see us encouraging more boys and men to go into caring professions. Think about being a teacher. Think about being a therapist. Think about going into medical care. To really see a push around that kind of career option and say that can be your purpose, and it can be a way that you contribute to the world and make a decent living and have a satisfying life. I'd really like to see that message spread out much more widely.
And it sounds like that can help meet some of the needs that we're seeing among our young people today. And just to circle back to my other question about the other factors, the cultural dynamics, I would love to ask Lisa, how would you say other factors like socioeconomic status, like race and ethnicity, like identity, how do these other factors shape the, again, gender differences that we're seeing?
So what we see, I think, is that when it comes to the rules of expression, I don't know that they're that different across different racial and ethnic groups, in grand scale, right? That what we see as a group, and I think, Sema, you may have some more granular data, is what Christopher said. Guys are really constrained, that we give them a very narrow emotional highway, 2 lanes, really, when we look at the data on this across racial groups, which is, you can express anger or you can express pleasure at someone else's expense. That's a terribly narrow universe. And whereas girls and women, in general, enjoy a much wider emotional highway across, a wide range of, diverse groups. So on that one, I don't have the super granular data. I don't know, Sema, do you have more specifics?
Yeah, I don't think the rules change, but I think how they manifest depending on the context changes. So one of the things we're seeing is that black and white boys and young men actually decline in their mental health when they go from adolescence to young adulthood, whereas for Hispanics, they actually start at a higher level of depression and anxiety, and then it remains steady, which is quite interesting to see. The other thing is that compared to black and Hispanic, white men or young boys tend to actually disengage from family relationships at a much greater level compared to others, which again talks back to this notion of connection, community, which again is manifesting in the data. So there are some important differences that are emerging. The other thing we're seeing is that there's a stronger sense of community among black boys, and actually a stronger sense of resilience as well, as it shows up, partly probably because of the sense of community that they're experiencing. So yeah, differences that we're seeing depending on the context in which they live. And then finally, I'll say Hispanic young men tend to be quite worried about socioeconomic, whereas for black boys, not surprising, they're worried more about violence and things like that. So patterns that I think make sense overall. But again, there's also a lot of nuance and differences. These are pretty large-scale generalizations. It doesn't mean it applies to everyone.
When we look at the data, I'm also fascinated to know how much does the data tell us around our youth having their needs met? Who's able to access care? Who is getting the care that they need? Do you have any insight into that?
The short answer is no. So one out of 3 youth who need care actually never access care. Those that access care, actually 40% of the time they received care pretty delayed, and another half of the time they actually drop out off of care. So if you look at that care continuum, it's really a small fraction that actually completes care. One of the things, going back to relationships, the most important factor for youth receiving care is their family relationship, because the top reason for youth not seeking care is actually their inability to express that need to their parents. It's logical, right? If you're an adolescent and you want to see a provider, you kind of need, Lisa, I'd love to hear from you. You're the provider. You kind of need, parental support or guidance. And we also, again, see for black youth, it's even worse. Their ability and their kind of, their care seeking is much more reduced. But there are many, many reasons. It's not just an access issue. It's an issue of stigma. There's still very high levels of stigma for being able to seek care. All youth report that. There's also this notion of they don't feel understood and heard, and actually many of them don't don't feel that providers can relate to them or they can relate to providers. So even when they start care, they actually discontinue because they just don't feel that connection, even being established. And then the final thing I'll say, which is really interesting, one of the things we saw in our data, about 45% of youth actually tried or actually see an opportunity to use apps, which I thought was interesting. That was a pretty high number. And they actually see that as a potential avenue because they see that as a space, it's a one-on-one space. But one of the things they also report is that they don't feel those apps or those digital tools are designed for them. So I do think there's a real opportunity here. Again, not to say that the digital is the solution, but there's an opportunity here of thinking about how can we design these solutions in a way that really works for youth and in a way that works for different types of youth. So that was an interesting thing that emerged.
So there's several things one can say here. So one is, and this came up in an earlier panel, before the pandemic, I was in the crew of snobbish clinicians who were like, you definitely cannot take care of patients online. Like, you just absolutely cannot, right? Turns out you can totally take care of kids online. And actually, there's something really wonderful about caring for a teenager digitally, because often they're in their bedroom, they're like draped over things, the cat goes by, and they are great at it. And this opened up, first of all, nobody had to drive them. We also found that for families who were struggling with poverty, they were suddenly showing up for these appointments in ways they hadn't because they didn't have to take 3 buses to get there. So the more that we can protect telehealth, that helps all teenagers, and it especially helps teenagers who are in stressed socioeconomic circumstances. So that is huge. The other thing we need to do is we need to work really hard to cultivate and protect the pipeline for clinicians of color. Kids need to be cared for, or better cared for, by people from their community. It really matters. And what you said about connection, this is a huge piece. So the SCOTUS decision several years ago has made this a little bit hard, but we are working very hard thinking about what are the ways that we can keep this pipeline going. The last thing I will say, the longer I practice, I'm 30 years in, the more elastic my view of what constitutes a therapeutic interaction is. Yes, it may be you get yourself to a therapist and we ask you the questions in our quiet offices. It may be a fabulous coach. It may be an incredible boss who has that kid's back. The beauty of teenagers is they start to connect to adults outside the family. So my view of it is the fluoride in the water, and fluoride is effective, the fluoride in the water of adolescent mental health is phenomenal adults around those kids. Ideally at home, but not every kid has that. But instead, or in addition to that, fantastic coaches, fantastic teachers, people who adore teenagers. Teenagers can smell this at 100 yards. And what I will tell you is a lot of this has to do with supporting teachers and education. If we make this a career that is unappealing, we're going to end up with warm bodies around kids who actually need fully invested adults.
And Christopher, I know that, you coordinate the San Francisco Unified School District's Young Men's Health Project, and connection is a big part of that project. So I feel like this is the perfect segue to ask you, what are you seeing when you work with young people through that program?
Thank you. Yeah, we have groups for middle school and high school boys, and this project was started 11 years ago, initially as a HIV prevention strategy. And it was okay at HIV prevention. What we found was that it was more powerful as a social, emotional intervention. So what we do is we have boys come to a group. It's outside of the wellness center, so part of the reason for connecting with, it's held in the wellness center, usually in a space adjacent to it. We have wellness centers in our schools, so getting people to services is much easier if the services are actually at the school. And we do still see the stigma around accessing care. So if you can get boys to come to a group that's housed by the wellness center with staff from the wellness center, then it becomes, oh, I know those people. When there's something troubling in my life, that's where I'm going to go because I trust them. So we have groups that really focus on letting down the mask, we call it, letting down the, and being vulnerable with one another, connecting with a leader, a facilitator, and we always try to have men leading those groups as much as possible. We try to have a pair of facilitators. We try to match the socioeconomic and demographics of the group members. In San Francisco schools, it's a very diverse population. We try to match that as much as possible and try to have younger staff members, if we can, leading those groups. And contrary to sort of stereotype, boys are super eager to actually get with a group of boys and talk about what it's like today, what kind of pressures they're facing, what masculinity means to them. And we've had a lot of success with those groups. We have more demand than we can keep up with for supporting those groups. And we have partnered with a community-based organization called the Ever Forward Club, which is founded by Ashanti Branch, who's a really great thinker around these issues. And he's a real specialist around connecting with boys of color. So it has been a tremendous learning opportunity for us. It's also helped with this pipeline issue because it opens up an opportunity for that conversation. You've gone through 8 weeks of a group that you really enjoy, and you're sitting there on the last day. That social worker can say, I'm a Latino social worker. Let me tell you my career path. Let me tell you how I got here. And by the way, I've seen the skills that you have with the other people in your group. You could do this job, or you could be a teacher, or you could be a therapist, and kind of opening up that pathway to careers and then being able to be a reference for that person, being a one-on-one mentor for them coming later and providing opportunities for leadership.
That's so fascinating. I also want to take a step back. You mentioned how in these groups, the students do talk about the pressures they're facing today. What are the pressures that they're facing today? What are they sharing with each other in these groups?
I think a lot of boys are really looking for guidance around what it means to be a man and to be a successful man in the world. A lot of people are talking about school pressures and feeling like they can't keep up. So we've seen a big decline in the number of men who are going to college and completing college. That is a concern for me. So sometimes they'll talk about just feeling like school's not a place for me. Often feeling like there's still these stereotypes that men are supposed to be breadwinners, they're supposed to bring in a lot of money and have fancy cars, and trying to keep up with those demands and that image. And often just not having a place to talk about those things. So you do see boys going online and looking up questions, and they'll often look up kind of basic questions. How do I get rich? How do I get girls to like me? How do I get bigger muscles? But the answers the internet gives them are not great, and you often kind of get led down this path to more extreme views, to people who want to sell you a plan for how to improve your life that really just improves their life. And a lot of messages around how girls are the source of your problems. A lot of blaming women and girls for the problems that boys are having in their lives. So it's really a matter of concern, and often adults don't know that much about what boys are seeing online. So I have a whole book called Talk to Your Boys that's coming out because I really think these are missing conversations that people need to be having about what is going on in the lives of middle school and high school and young men in early college years.
And so while these are conversations that are happening in this program that you just shared with us, how can we have these conversations at home? Like, how can we open that door to talk with our young boys about some of the pressures they're facing?
I think you want to look for every opportunity you can get. It is totally expected that young people individuate, and it's harder to spend time with them as they get older. So you want to look for those times when they're hanging around the kitchen a little bit longer, where you're going for a ride together, where they lie down in your bed, and you're like, why is this kid lying in my bed? Look for any chance that you can to talk to them. When you're watching something together, like actually talk about it. And kind of push past discomfort. These issues we're talking about, they're not easy to talk about. They're awkward, they're uncomfortable. I think we have to look for those and say, I'm willing to be awkward. Sometimes it's helpful to just name that. This is awkward to talk about, but I need to talk to you about porn. And then have a conversation about it. And get a guide ahead of time so you have some talking points and practice. You can practice with yourself, you can practice with a friend, but be willing to have some awkward conversations. And if you're a man, be willing to be emotional in front of other people and sometimes narrate your emotions, like this is how I'm feeling about the situation, this is how I'm feeling inside. Let them see you experiencing a whole range of emotions and let them know that that is a normal part of being a human being.
And Lisa, I am curious your thoughts on this question, and especially for parents in the audience who may have either a anxious girl, anxious daughter at home, or a lonely boy, lonely son at home. What are ways in which they can have these conversations with their children? And is there a difference in how you may want to approach the conversation with your daughter compared with your son?
I think it's probably the same across all teenagers. And the way I would have us approach it is to remember teenagers are organized around autonomy. It is their job to become increasingly independent. And so if we are the one always initiating, if we are saying, how are you feeling? Tell me how you're feeling. Their experience of this often is like, oh my gosh, I have been called to a meeting and you have set the agenda, right? And even if I was about to tell you how I was feeling, now I'm not going to do it. So to sort of go back to what you said about like watching for the ways in which they make themselves available, I have 2 adolescent daughters. My older daughter is now almost a senior in college, so she's late adolescent, 21. She's an adult. Okay, so, but I remember like when she was in high school, we would be at dinner. I'd be like, how was school? And she'd say, fine. And I'd say, what happened? And she'd say, nothing. And I'd be like, okay. And then, to your point, 10 o'clock at night, I am like, end of the day. I am reading my book. I am in bed. And then she would be standing next to me. Okay. So then I start realizing this is going on everywhere. And so I start asking teenagers, and I have the best job in the world, because I can go back to teenagers and be like, what's the deal with this? And they were like, oh, that's the best time to talk to your parents. And I said, why? And they said, because they don't ask new questions, and they don't bring up new topics. Right? That they have total control of that moment, and they need it. And so I think things like late at night or driving, sometimes kids will bring stuff up 2 minutes from the house. And it's because they know, I got 2 minutes, and then you are done with me. Like, you can't keep it going after that. And so take those moments. Don't squander those moments. And the thing I think we have to watch out for, and I have done this as a parent, is you're like, well, I tried to talk about them with this earlier today, and it went nowhere. And then kids will tell me later in the day they'll bring it up, and the parent misses it because they're sort of on to the next thing. So remaining available, taking those openings, looking for those openings, goes very far.
And being curious, I think. Lead with curiosity. If your kid is interested in something, even if it's of no interest to you, if your kid loves something, find out why they love it. Why is this video game so fascinating? Why do you want to spend hours playing this thing? What is that joke you're laughing at? I don't understand why it's funny. Explain it to me. Like, try and, or if they have a special interest, like, and they say, can you take me to this whatever event that is hard to figure out why they're into it? Take them. Like, all those opportunities, be curious about what they're into, engage with them, follow their interests, and just show that it's a way to show that you love them is to be curious and interested in what they're interested in.
And actually, just to build on that, sometimes kids will bring up a topic in a way that's alarming to adults, that they'll drop something like, oh yeah, the 8th graders were into weed gummies, right? This is like the last thing you want to hear. You can do 2 things at once if you say, oh, tell me what you think of that. The first is you can get yourself together, right? Because you're trying to figure out how to handle it. But you're, again, leading with curiosity, right? And your question, tell me what you think of that, whatever weird thing that they just dropped on you, lets you take a beat, and it also lets you know how the conversation's going to go from there. Because the kid's response is going to guide you to the kind of conversation you need to have. So I would say, like, that's like one of my top 3 lines in parenting teenagers. Like, oh, well, what do you think of that, right?
And it sounds like that puts the ball in their court
Yes.
where they feel like they're holding the meeting, not
You're not setting the agenda.
Yeah. And I'm curious what parenting experiences you have as well with opening or initiating conversation.
So I have a 15-year-old daughter. It's very similar. How was your day? Good. What happened? Nothing. I think for me, it's like stopping my self-urge to ask that question every day. I think I'm doing okay. But for me, it's also been looking for the signs when they want to tell you something. And one of the things I've learned, and every child is different, when my daughter starts talking a lot about some random stuff, I've learned that she's trying to tell me something which she's not able to tell me. So that's like her way of communicating with me or trying to communicate, and I think every child probably has a way. So that was for me a good learning. But I think for me, and I think it's similar to this, is it's just spending time. And for us, the best time is either agendaless walks, where we're going on these very long walks. There's no end in sight. We're shoulder by shoulder. There's no kind of face-to-face conversation. And amazing things come up on that walk. Or sitting at the beach and watching the waves. Again, no agenda, just sitting there. And I'm always impressed what we end up talking about because, again, we didn't set the agenda. It was a very free moment. So that's kind of my experience.
Well, thank you so much. I know we have many parents in the audience, so these were helpful insights, but I would love to open it up to any audience questions. We have about 10 minutes for questions here, and I'll start over here, then I'll work my way over, but please feel free to ask your question.
There's a microphone coming.
Thank you so much. So as a parent of a 14-year-old girl and an 11-year-old boy, listening to you talk, Lisa and Christopher in particular, I felt like you were living in my household for the last couple of years. So it was validating, if nothing else. I'm curious, you talked about belonging and social connections, and we talked about race and culture and ethnicity, but I'm wondering how gender identity, gender fluidity, and sexuality plays into that as well. Because those are conversations that I have with my children, and I know they're having in their friend groups about how they identify and how they be inclusive, and teaching us a lot as parents about how to kind of be on that journey. So I'm curious from your experiences how that kind of plays into this either increased anxiety or loneliness, or has the opposite effect because people find their groups in which they belong to.
In my experience, the kids are way ahead of us on this in terms of it being not a big deal. Like, it is a total nothing burger to them. And that's what it should be. And in my experience, and you've got more boots on the ground right now about this, when there's an issue, the adults have created it. And so I think we really need to follow kids' lead on this because they are as accepting and open-hearted as we should all strive to be in this.
And this comes up when we're working with the facilitators for the young men's health groups that I coordinate. There is sometimes a tendency with groups that work with boys to kind of lean on past stereotypes of like men will be men and like let's teach you how to be men in the old way. And I don't think that's the right way to go. I think we need to make it so that you can be who you want to be in the world, and that's going to be acceptable, and it's going to be safe, and that we will welcome you and embrace you and love you for who you are. So we want facilitators who reflect that. So there is a space for boys to be in a group together, but you get to decide, the boys get to decide if they call themselves a boy. Whoever wants to call themselves a boy can be in that group. And part of what we talk about is how to expand the definition of what a boy can be, and have actual conversations about that. And I think that's important.
Amen.
And I see another raised hand in the back there.
Thank you. Great panel, really compelling conversation. I have a 5-year-old, so I'm a little earlier in the journey. I'm curious what you think about gentle parenting and if we've gone a little too far. Are we a little too soft compared to how it was?
And gentle parenting is such a hot topic on social media, and I'm curious your
I'm happy to
thoughts.
take this. So here's what I can tell you. We have studied parenting and outcomes for kids for decades. We have literally hundreds of thousands of articles. If we could throw them all into a giant machine and say, give us the findings, it would say two things. Kids need warmth and kids need structure. That if we look at outcomes, and by outcomes I mean emotional, academic, all of these things, they need both. So the worry that many psychologists have, and I'll put myself in this camp, is that gentle parenting is all warmth and not nearly enough structure. And the key is you just want to hit a balance. You don't do all one or the other, right? So sometimes you need to say to your kid, what's going on? This is so not like you. And sometimes you need to say, knock it off already, right? And the goal here, we have to remember in raising kids, is that no one is ever going to think our kids are as cute as we think our kids are, right? And so they can't be doing things outside the house that are unacceptable. And so part of our job as child-rearing humans is to ready them for the world. And the world is going to ask them to conduct themselves in ways that reflect that they've had good structure at home too. That's that's where I'm at with it. So.
Yeah, no, I'm sorry. I was just going to add, I'm a big believer in building resilience in children for adulthood. So, yeah.
I'll move over to this side of the room now. I see in the back a raised hand. Yes.
This is an outstanding panel, and I want to ask a question that is going to be a little more somber, perhaps, in the tenor of the prior discussion. I understand, I'm not in this field, but I understand that suicide rates in African American children have somewhat skyrocketed in recent decades. And I think historically, the feeling was that somehow we were more resistant to the temptation, if you will, of suicide as a way out. I wonder if you have any insights into that trend, and I'm just very curious about what you might have to say about that.
Yeah, Lisa, would you like to start?
You are right that a few years ago we saw this big jump in death by suicide in teenagers who are Black. And so then there was suddenly like, go to the data and try to understand, look at the research, why is this happening? And what we found when we went to the data is that there were no data that broke out what the precursors were for suicide in Black versus white teenagers. It had all been lumped together. So there was actually a congressional committee that authorized a whole bunch of research. And it's happened, and some of it's, I'm based in Cleveland, some of it's coming out of Nationwide and in Columbus. The work is starting, but it is alarmingly new. We just didn't know. And what we are seeing is that there's different precursors in kids who are Black versus kids who are white when they take their lives, that it's not always the same contributing factors. We are also seeing very strong evidence of structural racism in the healthcare system, because a lot of kids who are dying by suicide who are Black were not getting diagnosed when they should have been diagnosed. We can see that in retrospect. So it's a very real issue. We are barely getting our hands around it, and we are extraordinarily late to the game. It's a real problem. So we're there, we're trying, but we've not looked at it in the way it deserves to be looked at.
Yeah. We can come here right to the front of the room now. Thank you.
I wonder if you could say something about anxious parenting. I made a beautiful attempt to have a conversation with my 3 adult children, and the response I got was awkward. So it was a really glorious moment. And so I was just intrigued by when you said, I don't know, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but youth may be doing better than we think, although there are obviously all these massive issues. I'm not sure if parents are. So I wonder if you've got any thoughts about anxious parenting and ways that we should think about having a conversation with ourselves in light of all the concerns we have for our kids.
I definitely, I think there's been a lot of media attention on teenagers overall and on boys that has raised people's alarms. I got a lot of calls when people watched the Netflix show Adolescent this year, which is a great drama, but makes people feel super panicked. And I don't think anybody is a good teacher or a good parent or a good therapist if they're in that panic mode. So it's good to recognize that, and then you've got to get past that before engaging with young people around it. To recognize they're human beings, they're going to have a range of feelings. You come in with concerns, but you want to de-escalate things yourself and be willing to kind of listen. And with older people, with older kids, it's more of a dialogue. And really starting with curiosity and trying to listen to them might be the best strategy to start with.
Lisa, do you have any thoughts?
So I've been practicing for about 30 years. I've never cared for a more anxious generation of parents. I will say that, no question. So let me give some reassuring news. So last year I was given a Gallup poll by the Walton Family Foundation. And so I got to ask adolescents across a very wide range of SES and socioeconomic and racial groups, what did you feel a lot of yesterday? They were 10 to 18-year-olds. Okay, here's what we heard back. 94% said happiness, 92% said enjoyment, 45% said stress, 39% said anxiety, 32% sadness, 32% loneliness. Okay, if you're doing the math, that is way more than 100%. It's because they have all of these feelings, right? And often before 9 a.m., right? They will have all of these feelings. So the critical thing when we're talking about adolescence is to keep it in 3D. Be very wary of anybody who tries to collapse teenagers down to simplified, two-dimensional caricatures. These are as rich and interesting and wonderful as humans can possibly be, but they're super complicated, but there's a lot of happiness too.
Yeah. I think that's such a hopeful note to end on, that the kids are all right, it sounds like.
And also not all right.
Yes,
Exactly.
and they experience both. Yes. Well, thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, Christopher. Thank you so much for your time. And thank you, everyone, for joining our conversation today, and enjoy the rest of your time in Aspen.